Polaroid Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in October 2001, listing assets of approximately $1.7 billion and liabilities of approximately $948 million. But the number that most precisely defined the company's financial condition was not on either side of that ledger. It was the environmental remediation liability associated with decades of chemical waste disposal at the Waltham, Massachusetts campus, where Polaroid had manufactured its instant film products, a liability whose estimated magnitude had been a subject of ongoing federal and state regulatory proceedings for years before the bankruptcy and whose full scope only became legible when the bankruptcy estate's asset and liability inventory was completed. Polaroid's Waltham campus was a Superfund site, the specific combination of events that produced Polaroid's 2001 bankruptcy, the digital photography disruption, the executive pension fund liability, the environmental remediation obligation, is one of the most precisely documented industrial-to-digital transition failures in American corporate history, and the campus where it played out, 750 Main Street in Waltham, Massachusetts, is the specific physical evidence of what a century of chemical manufacturing leaves behind when the company that conducted it cannot pay to clean it up. Edwin Land founded Polaroid in 1937 and spent 40 years building it into one of the most innovative companies in the history of American consumer technology. The instant photograph, the image that develops in your hand 60 seconds after exposure, was one of the most significant consumer technology innovations of the 20th century, producing a product category whose convenience premium over conventional film photography was genuine and whose consumer franchise was sufficiently durable that Polaroid remained a significant commercial enterprise for 3 decades after the technology's peak. The digital camera eliminated the instant photograph's convenience premium in approximately 5 years. By 2001, Polaroid was competing in a market that its founding innovation had been made irrelevant to. The campus, where that innovation had been manufactured, was simultaneously producing an environmental liability that the declining revenue base could not service. Subscribe now, because Polaroid documents the specific category of industrial company failure, where the environmental cost of the manufacturing that built the company becomes the liability that the company's declining revenues cannot manage and the bankruptcy estate cannot fully resolve. Polaroid's Waltham campus at 750 Main Street occupied approximately 27 acres in suburban Boston, comprising manufacturing facilities, research laboratories, and administrative offices whose operational history dated to the company's early manufacturing expansion in the 1940s and 1950s, when Polaroid's rapid growth from a startup to a major industrial employer had required the physical infrastructure that Waltham's industrial corridor provided. The manufacturing processes that Polaroid employed in its instant film production, the chemical formulations, the silver halide processing, the coating and lamination operations, generated the industrial waste streams that the regulatory environment of the mid-20th century did not require to be managed with the rigor that contemporary environmental standards mandate. Solvent disposal, chemical waste handling, and general industrial effluent practices at mid-century industrial facilities produced the soil and groundwater contamination that subsequent environmental testing documented at thousands of American industrial sites, Polaroid's Waltham campus among them. The Environmental Protection Agency's designation of the Waltham campus as a Superfund site under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CERCLA, imposed on Polaroid the potentially unlimited remediation liability that CERCLA's retroactive application creates. The company is responsible for the full cost of cleaning up the contamination its operations produced, regardless of whether the contamination occurred before the law was enacted, and regardless of whether the company's current financial condition can support the remediation cost. This CERCLA liability interacted with Polaroid's declining revenues from digital photography disruption in a specific and financially devastating way. As the revenue base contracted, the proportion of operating cash flow that the remediation obligation consumed increased, reducing the capital available for the technology investment that competitive response to digital photography required, and simultaneously making the balance sheet's environmental liability more prominent in any financing or transaction analysis. The digital photography disruption that eliminated Polaroid's core business did not arrive without warning. Kodak introduced its first digital camera in 1975. Sony introduced the Mavica in 1981. Consumer digital cameras were commercially available throughout the 1990s. Polaroid's management was aware of the disruption throughout the period of its most acute financial deterioration. The specific failure mode that Polaroid documents is not the failure to observe the competitive disruption. It is the failure to generate the strategic response that the observation required in the context of a company whose balance sheet was simultaneously burdened by the environmental liability, the executive pension obligations, and the debt service requirements that left insufficient capital to fund the technology investment that competitive repositioning demanded. A company with Polaroid's brand recognition, manufacturing expertise, and consumer relationship in the late 1990s had viable strategic options: acquisition by a digital imaging company, repositioning as a specialty printing or photo services company, licensing the brand to digital camera manufacturers. The options existed. Executing them required capital that was not available. The environmental liability consumed capital. The pension obligations consumed capital. The debt service on the bonds that had funded Polaroid's mid-1990s expansion consumed capital. The convergence of those three obligations in a company whose revenues were simultaneously contracting under digital competition produced a specific financial condition that 2001's Chapter 11 filing documented. The bankruptcy estate's most difficult challenge was not the distribution of Polaroid's brand and intellectual property assets. Those were eventually sold through a bankruptcy auction process that generated proceeds substantially below what the assets would have commanded in a non-distressed transaction. The most difficult challenge was the environmental remediation liability, whose allocation among the bankruptcy estate, the insurance carriers who had provided environmental liability coverage, and the state and federal regulatory agencies who had claims on the responsible parties required years of negotiation after the bankruptcy proceedings concluded. The Waltham campus's disposition following the Polaroid bankruptcy reflects the specific real estate challenge that contaminated industrial sites present. A property whose underlying land value is substantially reduced by the remediation obligation that CERCLA imposes, making the property's development economics dependent on the resolution of an environmental liability whose magnitude is uncertain and whose remediation timeline is determined by regulatory agencies rather than by market conditions. The redevelopment of 750 Main Street into the contemporary mixed-use complex that now occupies the site required the completion of a multi-year EPA-supervised remediation process, the resolution of the CERCLA liability allocation among multiple responsible parties, and the identification of a development entity willing to invest in a site whose environmental history created both a due diligence challenge and a stigma discount in the development financing market. The campus that Edwin Land built to manufacture the instant photograph is now office and research space. The instant photograph is no longer manufactured there or anywhere else in the United States. The chemical contamination that the manufacturing produced required approximately 2 decades of regulatory oversight and private remediation investment before the site was available for development. What the Polaroid campus case reveals in the context of this channel's 110-case archive is a specific intersection of industrial disruption, environmental liability, and real estate that this channel has not previously documented in this precise configuration. The industrial campus whose owner's bankruptcy produces not only the standard purpose-built campus disposition challenge, but the additional burden of an environmental remediation obligation whose cost is uncertain, whose timeline is regulatory rather than market-driven, and whose allocation requires separate resolution from the bankruptcy's commercial creditor distribution. The instant photograph lasted 64 years. The chemical residue from making it lasted longer. The bankruptcy lasted 5 years. The remediation lasted 20. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication.